Hey, good morning, everyone in political science and American government. I thought I would do a fairly quick review of Chapter 6, which relates to public opinion in the political realm. It's an important chapter. I think it's a bit lengthy, and I don't agree with everything in the chapter, but that's why we're going to have a discussion about it. Um, Public opinion is very important. What is the public sentiment on different views related to our functioning of government, what society should or shouldn't do with regard to um, expenditures of federal funds and or creating laws. It's all interrelated. Um, what's interesting is I thought the book did a really nice job starting off with the introduction with regard to Mitt Romney, believing he um, was about to defeat Barack Obama in the election, and his internal poll numbers suggest just that. Basically, his gauging of public opinion and what was likely going to be the response of active voters suggested in his internal workings that he was going to win that election right up to that evening. In fact, he didn't even have a concession speech written. He had to do it on the fly because he lost to him a stunning loss. He thought he had won. And so the reason why we gauge public opinion, if those of us who act in the political realm, we want to know what the people are interested in, and not only that, what the views are. Some of us want to do it for a Machiavellian reason. If you ever hear the term Machiavellian, and I'm surprised the book doesn't talk about this philosophy earlier in the text, but Machiavellian philosophy is it's about winning. And in order to stay in power or to get in power, you often have to pander on some level to what the most popular ideology or viewpoint is on a number of political issues, or whether or not the political issue is even important to the American people or to the local community that you're running in or engaged in. And so it's important to keep abreast of what is, in fact, the trending position of society. Isn't easy to do. The other thing the book doesn't seem to stress as much that I'd stress a lot more is what are our politicians doing? What is their job? What is their function? And we live in a Republican form of democracy, meaning it's representative. If I'm your representative, what should I be doing? I think there's one argument, or a major argument, a major theme is I should be doing what my citizens want me to do. If my citizens want me to pass a law reducing taxes, I should be fighting for that. If my population or my community wants me to fight for more funding for education or more educational standardization or something like that, that's what I'm supposed to fight for. Internally on the or externally or in self-interest mode, the Machiavellian view is I better be responsive to my citizens or I might be thrown out of office. I just finished an excellent book on John F. Kennedy. It was John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1956. He obviously lived a longer period of time than that, but it's reflective of his coming of age during that era. And one of the topics in the book was a discussion about his own political philosophy, how he developed it. And one of the things along the way is he wrote a book. It actually won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's called Profiles in Courage. I know there's arguments about whether he really wrote it or did have a lot of contribution by a guy named Ted Sorensen. I think there's a great deal of proof that John F. Kennedy was the main architect of the book, and contributed to it significantly. So he does still deserves some of the credit for writing this book. But what the book is about is what I'm really trying to allude to. He wrote a book about certain politicians throughout history who have often done things that aren't popular. Because the question is even though we want to know what the public wants, what they think, what they feel, what they believe, should we always cater to that? Because sometimes we have our own personal assessment based upon facts, law, history, ethics, and morals that might run contrary to what's currently popular. And so, should we do what we believe in our heart and our mind is what's correct, or should we be responsive to what the people want? And I think both our intention. Sometimes they're in agreement, and sometimes they're not. But we do want to know what public opinion is, and that's what the book Chapter 6 is really about. And it starts off with it's a little bit disjointed. That's one reason why I don't like the chapter that much, is about political socialization. How do we come up with our opinions? Why do we believe certain things about certain questions that are in the political realm at any given moment. Gun rights versus gun control, or measures related to that, educational expenses versus educational standardization, money for healthcare versus you're on your own. This is a capitalist society, and government shouldn't be responsible for taking care of every aspect of our individual lives. Sharing of wealth, taxation, redistribution of funds, laissez-faire, helping business or staying out of business. All of these kinds of political ideations develop over time, and the book does a pretty good job. I wish it wasn't as scattered. I wish it focused on one section. It was, how do we develop these things? And here I find it interesting. Most of us, whether we like it or not, tend to do or develop political ideology related to what our parents often think, or our significant others throughout time. When I was a kid growing up, I said, I'm never going to be like my father. Politically or socially, I am a carbon copy of what he was in large part. I admit that proudly, actually. When you're young, you kind of question, you think your parents are a little bit unusual, or there's a period of rebellion maybe in terms of trying to think like them or wanting to think like them. But I have to admit, and the book does a pretty good job on that, how do we come to develop our beliefs? And part of it is through what our family views as correct or appropriate or meaningful. Our religion, our ethnicity, our community. And one of the big ones that I thought the book should have elaborated on this is our education. Many of us are educated through the public school system, but even in private school systems, there's a socialization process. We're taught to usually genuflect or obey authority figures, people who are placed in charge. We don't always question why they're in charge, but they lay down the rules and we're expected to follow them. That's what being a good person does. And because of that socialization process, we're often taught to respect the flag, and therefore respect governance and respect leaders in titled positions. And although some of us will have at times in our lives where we question authority and get a bit to be a contrarian like I am on some issues, for the most part, we're socialized into these kinds of views, whether they're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. And it comes from a number of factors. I don't want, well, I guess I can reveal what I grew. It's no secret what I grew up as. I grew up in like a working class family that was Catholic. My father was Catholic, at least. My mother was Protestant. It created a dynamic of its own in the family. But, we went to church almost every week. We hated it, but we went. My father kind of expected of us. And we were taught things like, to be respectful of authority, to actually admire people in government. At least in my family, it was, except for my sister, who was older, and she was really grown up in the 60s, and she was much more questioning of authority. It's ironic now, she's much more like my father later in life. But we go through these processes. It's the age that you're at. Look at my sister, grew up in a different era than I did, because she was basically kind of a half a generation earlier, because she's 10 years older than I am. So it's really an interesting dynamic. The communities you grow up in, what you're exposed to, you develop philosophical views based upon those things. Do some people break away? Yeah, some people end up resenting a great deal what their parents and what their educational system taught them was right and wrong, and what's noble and what's not noble. But we know for the most part, those have huge impacts on how we view life and political questions as they become before us. But then it gets into the whole polling process. And one thing that is very important, and you're thinking about, there's not a lot of test fodder in here that I think it's really that important, except that why we consider polling important in gauging public opinion is, at one time we were a more centrist country, meaning people fell in the middle, sort of a moderate view. And there is a fair amount of evidence based upon polling and identifying political ideology that we've become polarized. There are people that are intolerant of other people's views. They're either very far right or they're very far left, and there's no real middle ground where people tend to compromise the way they have in the past. This isn't just a recent phenomenon. This has been happening over the past several decades, although we've always had a great deal of polarization between many people throughout political history. You can go back to the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. That was very the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or the Republican Democratic Party under Jefferson and the Federalist John Adams, are very, very bitter. But they tended to be less bitter universally. It's, I'm right and you're wrong is the attitude that we seem to have been developing over the years. And I personally don't think it's healthy for American political um, stability and for progress, because we have to work with people who have different ideas and ideals um, to have success. And it's really sad how politically split we are. At one time, if you use a sort of a diagram where a political party, everyone kind of fell sort of, there's people out in the outskirts, but we fell in the middle. Now we have like two hump. Think of it as a two hump camel, and those humps are growing further and further apart. It's hard to be in the middle. And I'm very much involved in political, I don't know, observation and sometimes political activity. And I find the worst thing it can almost be is in the center, where I think I fall on many issues, because if you're not far to the left, you're not going to do well in the party that represents the more liberal stances of political views. And if you're not extremely far to the right, you're not going to get support from political leaders in the conservative political parties. If you fall somewhere in the middle, you kind of get ignored, it seems. But still, historically, I think most people do fall in the middle. I'm very tough to pin down overall, and that's one thing I don't like about your book. It seems to suggest that you either have a liberal ideology or a conservative ideology or a kind of a centrist thing. I think it depends on the issue. I tend to be very, very conservative on some issues, extremely liberal on other issues, and I don't think it's easy to pigeonhole me as a liberal or conservative, just pretty much like my father. But is there a general trend with many people? They're either left of center or they're right of center, and then it's a degree of how far they fall on that tangent or that gradient scale. Sure, and a number of factors go into those things. Like if you gave me factors like if someone's wealth, where they grew up, the level of their education, their ethnicity, would I have some degree of predictability for where they probably stood on that gradient scale in general political philosophy? Yeah, you can. You can develop those things. And why do we care? Well, if we're going to be scientists, political science is part of the name of this course, we want to understand voting trends. And so if we're going to sponsor a candidate, we don't want to spend a lot of time and effort going after voters who are unlikely to support our candidate's views and philosophies. Or maybe our candidate doesn't have clear articulation of their view in certain areas, and we want to be able to frame an outlook that will appeal to those voters if we think they're going to actively support our candidacy. And it's something that, I've been involved in some political teams. We sit down and we formulate what's likely to be the most popular view for the most likely voters. Why do we want to spend a lot of time on someone who never votes? Unless we think there's a very special election coming up, that someone who's been sitting on the sideline who hasn't participated but are registered, or they're not registered and are willing to become registered to get politically active. It's a lot of effort and a lot of money. So we want to find out what's popular, what's likely to carry the day without, moving from our core values. And that's what a lot of politicians get reputations for. It's doing it. They put so you feel where the wind is going, and you get on whatever side is popular. I think that's really sad, but that's the Machiavellian view. Whatever's going to get you elected is what you do in terms of stances on political views. I think it's highly inappropriate. I think most of you do as well. But let's face it, that's what people do. It's like if I'm a singer, I'm going to sing the song that the audience wants to hear, not the one that they don't like. And in the same with political ideology and views and outlooks, we're going to probably cast ourselves consistent with those things that are going to get us elected. Kind of sad in some respects. Socialization ideology, and they have the different spectrums. It's funny, if you look through history, for example, the book I thought could have done a really nice job on African American voting. No group is monolithic. What do I mean by that? You can't say, every African American male is likely to vote for this candidate, or every African American female, or every female is going to vote this way. Every male is going to vote this way. Everybody in their 50, that's 50 years old is going to vote that way. Every 19-year-old or 20-year-old is going to vote this way. You can't think monolithically, but can you think in terms of generalities based upon predictive opinion polling? Yeah. At one time, it's going to surprise some people, African Americans, in terms of where their ideology used to have allegiance to, it would have been the Republican Party right up until 1929, because the Republican Party, especially the radical Republicans of the 1880s, the Civil War arguably freed African American slaves shortly thereafter allowed them to participate in civic life with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. And these were the Republican parties that were advocating for this at the time. They almost uniformly voted in very strong numbers for the Republican Party candidates. Why did that change? Because the Republican Party was also identified with big business and the stock market and laissez-faire economic policies for the economy. And then after the stock market crash, it was the Democratic Party that started picking up the mantle of taking tax dollars and taking government activity to provide for the poor, the disenfranchised, those that needed a social network like unemployment, welfare benefits, public housing. All of those things changed in the 1930s, and therefore the party allegiance of would change. What party is actually representing my needs? And so we sometimes change political ideology. And so in the 1930s and 1940s, not universally, don't think of any group as monolithic, but African Americans started shifting to the Democratic Party as a result of seeing that party being more responsive to the social needs of that community at that time. And it changed and it ebbs and flows. Immigrants tended to always, not always, but for a long period of time, have been identified with the Democratic Party, especially during Andrew Jackson's era. They often were seen as new to the political stage. They were often poor. They were often uneducated. They were working class. And it was the Democratic Party that often seemed to be reflective or promoting their interests more than the Republican Party. The Republican Party often stood for small government. So people that want to, hey, just leave me the hell alone. I want to do my own thing and I don't want a lot of interference from government, often identified, at least in the 20th century, with the Republican Party. And all these different philosophies change over time. Female voters right now tend to be more inclined to be have an allegiance with the Republican Party, but it's not universal. Never think of any group as universal. Why? If you thought it was universal, that women tend to favor Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton would be president right now. A significant, not a majority, but a significant amount of women voters voted for Donald Trump, enough for him to carry the election. So you can't think of any one group as monolithic. Some groups are very difficult to pigeonhole. One of them is the Latino and Chicano. I use those terms loosely because I don't always have clarity in identifying them, but that group is a very complex group, some of them being very much on the conservative spectrum, others being very, very liberal. Very difficult to pigeonhole that group based upon their racial or ethnic identity. So you shouldn't pigeonhole anybody in a big group anyways, but we can look for dynamics. Education's another. The more highly educated you are, you're more likely to vote what? Probably left of center, more towards the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party. And that's not universal. There are plenty of people with all kinds of degrees in education that are going to vote conservative and beyond the spectrum to the right as opposed to the left. But the book is trying to allude, how do we figure out public opinion and where it sits on any given issue? Polling is very, very dangerous. There is a science to it. The science is legitimate. The problem happens to be so why do we care about polling? Well, we'll just ask everyone what their view is. We'll figure it out. It's just impossible. There's just way too many people to do it. It's way too expensive. So we have to do something called sampling. And there is some scientific validity to a very small group, 1,000, 1,500 people out of hundreds of thousands. If done appropriately, and if it's designed well, it can actually gauge the reflection of the entire group. And people say, well, that's just it can't. You got the wrong 1,500 people out of the 5 million that you did a sample on, and it can't possibly be reflective. The science suggests it would be if the questions are done appropriately and the parties randomly are selected such that it's a true random sampling. Very difficult to do. And that's the problem, is how you actually create these polling situations to get the numbers, and whether or not the data coming in is good, because if data in is bad, data out is garbage. Garbage in, garbage out is the old saying when it comes to polling. Very, very difficult process. And the whole other, I think another issue is I, for example, won't participate in polling. So it's hard to get a true random sample. If every single American citizen always participated in the random sample that was given, the numbers would be reflectively accurate. But we know they use them on certain things like computers. Now, most people have computers, but a lot of elderly people who do participate in the democratic process often don't have email and aren't responsive to polling through the email process. And back in the most famous, I think the most famous polling era, I should say, or error, so three different ways, was Harry Truman versus Thomas Dewey in a 1948 election. Truman was pretty unpopular. It was a very tough time in American history. He looked like he was going to lose. He campaigned the hell out of it, though, and Thomas Dewey kind of rested on his laurels, like thinking, I'm just going to win because Harry Truman's so unpopular. And Thomas Dewey got endorsements from all the major newspapers, but they did polling back in that era, and that was a lot of people had phones. Which people? Middle and upper class people had phones. People that still participated in the democratic process often didn't. So those polls taken by phone was an inaccurate random sampling. There's another famous one, Alf Landon. And you guys probably don't know what I'm talking about. Alf Landon, pretty popular business guy. He thought government was doing way too much in terms of interfering with individual sort of society activities under the FDR administration during the Depression. And they did a polling based upon Reader's Digest membership. And Reader's Digest polling suggested that Alf Landon was going to win in a landslide. And the people that read Reader's Digest tended to be more conservative and more Republican-oriented than Democrats at that time in that era. So it's really important depending on who you poll. Like if I go down to, I shoot guns sometimes, and I go to a range, and if you go there and poll people there on the issue, it's amazing that it's not universal. Again, it's not a monolithic group. They don't vote all together. But in terms of a great majority, people at the gun range, when I talk to them about issues, I try not to reveal my political ideology. They tend to be extremely conservative, very pro-Republican, because one of the most important things in their lives is their enjoyment of guns, and they're very fearful about losing them, and they view the Republican Party as more protective of the Second Amendment than they do the Democrats, which isn't always true, but that's basically a sort of a consensus belief. So be careful if that's all you're going to poll is gun owners over the issue of who you're going to vote for in the upcoming election. Just like if all we're going to do is poll college professors from the community college through the undergraduate through graduate level teaching criteria in terms of who they're going to vote for, that's probably going to come out much more liberal. So how do you get a good random sample? It's a science. And the science tends to be very valid if the random sample is solid. And people say, well, how can just polling 1,000 people out of 1,000,000 give a true representative sample? It's just like a blood test. Does a doctor need to drain all my blood to determine what's made up of my blood, or do they need a very small amount to determine what the makeup of my whole is? Very small amount. The analogy is not exactly perfect, but it's very, very similar. So they give the polling. They talk about all the different, the different kind of flaws in polling. If you've ever been subject to a push poll, I have. There's going to be test questions on the vocabulary at the end of the chapter. It's right in the book material. It's fantastic. But one of them is push polling. Push polling isn't really asking you a question. It's really trying to lead you to have a certain opinion. And go, is it fair to say you would support candidate James Corman if you knew he fought for citizens' access to excellent health care? Well, that's obviously a question that's not just asking a question, but it's promoting me as a good doobie that's doing stuff for society. Or how about this one? Would you vote for his opponent, Adam Smith, if you knew that he didn't support the rights of people within his community? You're not really asking a question, are you? You're trying to, I'm using completely obscenely leading questions, and that's what a leading question is. It has an answer that's obvious within the question to lead the recipient in a certain fashion. But some of them are written in a very, very creative, seemingly at first blush objective fashion, but they're designed to undermine the legitimacy of the answer. And they're called push polls. And why do we have them? Because say I sent out a bunch of pollers to go out and ask questions of people with a design like that, I could come back and say, we sent out a poll and we found that our favorability rating on this issue related to healthcare or related to education is 95% positive. Well, it's 95% positive because the way we asked the question made it ridiculous to answer in the opposite. So push polls are a big issue. And the other problem with polling, I think the biggest problem, the book doesn't seem to suggest as much, people just don't like to participate in it. And the thing that's absolutely true in the Donald Trump Hillary Clinton election was I think a lot of people supported Donald Trump and or disliked Hillary Clinton, but weren't comfortable saying that. So even if they participated in the polls, they would be interviewed maybe live by a person. And if I felt that person probably supported Hillary Clinton, what would my answer probably be more likely? I supported Hillary Clinton today in the election, or I'm going to support her next week in the election. Sometimes we respond to pollsters in a way in which they want to hear that information. And also, we're concerned about whether or not we're being identified. So if someone comes to my address, knocks on my door, and say, "Who do you support?" I say, "Geez, I don't want to say I support Attila the Hun, or I don't want to say I support this other wacky candidate because I'm kind of uncomfortable with knowing my position." And that's why sometimes we get shocking results. Polls, garbage in, garbage out. They're not always accurate. In fact, those of you that watched that election, I watched several. The Kerry election, Kerry through polling was suggested on the evening of the election itself that he had won the election. He lost. And the bigger one, more recent history, was Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. Right up until very late at night, the polls suggested, these are called exit polls. People coming right out of the voting booth. There's a person with a clip chart. They come, "Hey, would you answer a couple questions real quick?" And you get not only who they voted for if they participate, but also, what's important to them. They ask a number of questions and they produce that data in the news media. News media had Hillary Clinton winning right up until the very late hours of that evening. Never forgot it. And then they just recognized their polls were flawed. They didn't either get accurate answers, or those that were willing to participate maybe carried the day in the election. Got to be very careful with public opinion. But what the public thinks is important for another whole level. Besides us as scientists figure out what do the public want. Think about it. If I'm down in Washington, and maybe I don't have a big personal view on, I don't know, the death penalty or minimum mandatory sentencing on drug dealers. I do have opinions on those things, but say I didn't. But I'm your politician. I'm your leader. I want to know how my citizens feel. I want to be able to be reflective on that to some degree. And I want to know about those topics. And here's the thing that's, I think, most troublesome is we don't always know that something's even a topic unless we ask our constituents what's important to them. Sometimes one I think most constituents don't care for is what's the national debt going for. I mean, it's often in the news and some politicians talk about it. I just don't think anybody gets really all that excited about it if it doesn't affect their daily living. I think things that affect their daily living is, right now, COVID, taxes, eviction, unemployment, job stability, and educating our kids. I'm thinking, I'm obviously doing what? I'm using my own bias in this, but you got to think about it. Like maybe all of a sudden somebody else is worried about, I don't know, the emission standards in cars because they're very or the whole new Green Deal, there's global warming issues going on, or the lack of that being a real issue in some people's minds. So we want to get that kind of reflected in the knowledge base. And one thing that I was concerned about, what impacts public opinion, because it's going to be covered later in a big chapter, is the media. Think about it. If I'm a citizen and I don't know what's going on because the media is not covering that story. Maybe a bunch of the population of cod off the coast of Massachusetts are dwindling significantly, but the media is not covering it because it doesn't get a lot of interest from the viewers of that news channel. They won't cover. They want to cover the things that are sensational, like what are the Kardashians doing, or who won the football game last night. It's really amazing how much power the media has informing public opinion, or keeping the public opinion vacuous, meaning there is no public opinion on the issue because people just aren't aware these things are going on. And we'll get to that in a later chapter, but it has to be talked about briefly in this chapter as well. And the book does a nice job talking about all the different things that affect. The thing about 9/11 is a perfect example. Sometimes major events can shift your political philosophy, including myself. I'm very libertine. I'm a very liberal person when it comes to civil rights in terms of the police officer's ability to search, to do it without a warrant. And if there is a warrant, it really has to be justified by probable cause, by neutral detached magistrate. I think that's very important. But did 9/11 shift my position to a more conservative one, that law enforcement maybe should have more liberty in potentially invading those sacred rights in order to protect society, because maybe a terrorist action is going to occur, violence is going to occur, and we need to ferret that out to stop a major mass killing or the like. Yeah. And did it wane since then? Yeah, I've come back the other way somewhere because things have gotten quieter. But we do often react because of huge political events, and not just political events, but just life events can dramatically shift their position. I'll tell you one that is, which obviously impacted me greatly, is healthcare. I've got 7 kids. and I have good health insurance for my kids, but there was a time when I was completely self-employed and I had to have a policy, and it costs a fortune for a family plan being self-employed, and it really, really worried me. So did it change my view about access to healthcare and maybe liberalize my viewpoint on that? So, yeah, because of experience. Our life experiences change things like that. Our education, our family, our religious practice or lack of religious practices and involvement, all of those things. Friends and family. You meet a significant other, and you're with them, and if they have very, very strong viewpoints on something that maybe you're not so engaged in, it's probably going to shape your view to some point. And maybe you end up breaking up with that person and you end up hating them, and it makes you become on the opposite end of the view, because if they like the view, they must have been wacky, right? So everything impacts your own ideology on so many, many different levels. Good experience, bad experience. I know one that's really important is if you ever met somebody in politics. I remember meeting John Glenn, the famous astronaut. A lot of people don't know this, but he ran for president for a very short period of time in 1984. And I met him. He came out to Springfield Technical Community College and he spoke. And I met him for like 10 seconds, and I'm walking through the scene line. Hi, how you doing? And guess who I was in favor of after that and wanted to campaign for and work for? Yeah, it was John Glenn, because I met the guy. So experiences in life, connection to political ideology and party. My father tended to be a contrarian, so if I started thinking I want to be this way, he would play devil's advocate and constantly challenge me. So I find myself being like that. I have a tough time staying with party. I have a tough time staying with group consensus, because I almost feel a need to be contrary to what the popular flow is, or at least challenge it in my own mind, because I'm a human enough to recognize I can often be wrong. So I do tend to, I'm not a river that just goes down straight, at exactly the same, I keep edging away at the boundaries of that path that I go, because I want to think about it a little bit. It's not, answers aren't yes and no, they're often more nuanced. And so I tend to be uncomfortable with being strong in my conclusions over time. I think many of you probably think like me too. Others are very, very firm. I know this is what I believe on this issue, and nothing's going to change me. And that's fine too. But we need to gauge it. And that's what this chapter is about. Some of you are going to find this chapter very, very dry. I get it. But we still have to measure it. We still have to know it. And there's some information. There'll be some test questions on some of mostly on the vocabulary and why it's important to understand both the legitimacy and the fallacy and how we measure public opinion through polling, because that's really the most true method by which we try to figure out, how the wind is blowing and what people believe and are concerned with. It's not my favorite chapter, if you couldn't tell already. It's a bit loose and it's a bit thematic and it's a lot of theory, but some of it has testable objective standards. So hopefully enjoy it. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions or raise concerns as we go. Be well.